Greetings, class, and welcome to Week 9, Lecture 1, The Presidency of George Washington. As we have noted in previous lectures, Washington was a Federalist, that is, one of those founders who believed the loose union created by the Articles of Confederation to be fatally flawed, incapable of securing and guaranteeing the rights and liberties the founders had envisioned. The Articles were, he once wrote, a rope of sand. However, in spite of these feelings, he had originally hesitated to attend the Constitutional Convention, given that the convention's purpose was not to amend the Articles as publicly stated, but to replace them, a proposition of doubtful legality. After being persuaded to attend by Benjamin Franklin, though, he not only attended, but agreed to chair the convention. He then supported the so-called Virginia Plan of James Madison, which submitted a template for the Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. After revision, the adoption of a Bill of Rights, which were mostly but not completely drawn from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and a lengthy public relations effort led by Alexander Hamilton that was later collected and titled the Federalist Papers, the Constitution was ratified on June 21, 1788, and took effect April 30, 1789, which was also the inauguration day of George Washington as the United States' first president. As president, Washington recognized that his conduct and performance would establish precedents and standards for the behavior of all future presidents. Also, as president, he faced significant challenges. These included a more than $77 million in debt left over from the Revolution and subsequent period of economic disorganization under the Articles of Confederation, a worthless currency, an undefined power of taxation, a weak and ineffective bureaucracy, and a lack of senior officials with specific responsibilities. There were also pressing international problems, such as unrest in France, the United States' closest ally, and a significant number of British military forts along the western frontier, from where British agents continued to harass the colonies and create trouble with the native tribes. Washington's efforts during his first term, then, could largely be summarized as organizing and building the government of the United States into something equal to the tasks it faced, and managing crises both inherited and new. Like all presidents since, Washington's first task was to assemble his administration. Washington deeply distrusted political parties, or as he called them, factions. To this end, he appointed officials with widely divergent views, most notably Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, who clashed constantly over policy differences for Washington's entire tenure in office and caused Washington endless headaches in his attempt to mediate between these two brilliant and headstrong ideologues. Alexander Hamilton was perhaps Washington's most significant appointment. As Secretary of the Treasury, it was his responsibility to sort out the massive economic problems facing the U.S. and put the new nation on a sound financial footing. Shortly after his appointment, Hamilton presented a report to the Congress entitled The First Report on the Public Credit, an analysis of the nation's economic problems and recommended solutions for them. A large part of the problem was debt, much of which was owed to private Americans, especially veterans of the American Revolution who, at the end of the war, had been paid in IOUs, which had become nearly worthless under the Articles of Confederation, which had lacked any coherent method of raising the money to pay them. As the holders of these IOUs fell into economic need, many sold their IOUs to speculators, often for only pennies on the dollar. A dispute arose about how to pay these IOUs. Should the new government pay the full face value to the speculators, or should the government repay the speculators what they had paid for the bonds and pay the difference to the original holders, or should the government pay the original holders the face value and pay the speculators the value they could have expected to make from their purchase of the bonds? Hamilton's view was that the bonds should be paid in full, but only to whoever held them, in order to establish the nation's credit. Another of Hamilton's recommendations was the assumption of all the debts of the states by the federal government. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson bitterly opposed both of these. The first one because they considered it the defrauding of war veterans by wealthy speculators, including some congressmen, and the second because many states, especially in the South, had already paid down their debts and felt they were being unjustly forced to pay for others. This opposition created a deadlock with no clear solution in sight. However, a solution to this dilemma was eventually reached, a compromise with profound and far-reaching effects, the Compromise of 1790. For agreeing to drop their opposition to the assumption of the debt, the administration would agree to move the capital to a district on the Potomac River, as desired by the Virginians and many other Southerners. The Residence Bill and the Assumption Bill, both passing with narrow majorities, thus moved the capital, paid off the IOUs, and assumed the state debt. Having assumed the debt, Hamilton now had to figure out how to pay it. Hamilton's answer was a broad-based plan. It included the issuing of new bonds, tariffs on imported goods, excise taxes on selected products such as whiskey, and postal revenue. Following the adoption and success of his first plan, Hamilton then issued a second report, which called for the establishment of a Bank of the United States, a private bank funded by the public, now considered a model for the present-day Federal Reserve System, which was adopted again over the opposition of Madison and Jefferson. Following this, Hamilton recommended the adoption of a tariff to protect manufacturers, which was again adopted. Taken together, the solution to the economic problems of the Revolutionary period, the establishment of good American credit, and the promotion of American manufacturing have to be considered among the most profound and long-lasting accomplishments of the Washington administration. These were achieved not so much by Washington himself, but by Washington's recognition and empowerment of the right person for the job, and with his resolute support of those efforts in the face of powerful opposition. Of course, there were unforeseen problems. One of the biggest was the deep unpopularity of one of Hamilton's excise taxes, the one on whiskey. In many agricultural regions of the new country, grain farmers were accustomed to converting part of their crop to whiskey, which was then traded or even used as a currency in some places. Grain farmers felt they were being unfairly taxed, often using the language of the Revolution itself. The Washington administration pointed out that these were not taxes being levied without representation, but levied by the elected representatives of the people. Nonetheless, the opposition increased, with some of the more radical of the rebels adopting the violent strategies of early revolutionaries, such as the tarring and feathering of tax collectors, and court officials serving warrants on those refusing to pay or attacking officials. After more than 500 rebels attacked the Bower Hill home of a tax official in Pennsylvania, more than 7,000 rebels then marched through Pittsburgh. Washington, faced with an armed insurrection, recognized his dilemma. A weak or ineffective response would discredit federal authority, while too heavy a hand in response would inflame sympathy for the rebels. Therefore, Washington at once sent a commission to negotiate, and also called out the militia. The rebels were offered amnesty in return for renouncing further violence, and the divided rebels mostly fled and hid before the militia, numbering almost 13,000 men, the size of Washington's army in the Revolutionary War, before they could arrive with Washington himself at its head, the only time in American history a sitting U.S. president has commanded troops in the field. Of the 10 men who were captured, only 2 were convicted and then were pardoned by Washington. The incident served to greatly enhance the reputations of both Washington and his government. Washington had put down the rebellion without massive bloodshed or tyrannical rule, and the government, unlike during the paralyzed, ineffective response to the earlier Shays Rebellion, had acted promptly and decisively. In Europe, the French Revolution had descended into the bloody anarchy of the Great Terror, dividing Americans between those sympathetic to French Republicans, but repelled by the mass use of the guillotine on thousands of French citizens. Washington recognized the danger of being drawn into an endless cycle of conflicts between competing French and British empires, declared American neutrality, dividing Americans further between elitists like Hamilton, who wished to join the British, and Americans like Jefferson who remembered France's decisive intervention in the Revolution, which had proven so critical to American success, and who wished to support France. At the same time, American negotiations with Great Britain began to pay off. The Jay Treaty, negotiated by Federalist Papers co-author John Jay, averted war with Britain, which had been threatened due to American reneging on the terms of the Treaty of Paris that had ended the Revolution. The Jay Treaty settled these questions, settled the question of the exact location of the border with Canada, removed British forces from the forts on the frontier, and allowed American merchants access to the British colonies in the Caribbean. In spite of the Jay Treaty gains, it was bitterly opposed by Jeffersonians in Congress, who feared being drawn into an alliance with Britain, and who also considered it a betrayal of France. This division led to the rise of distinct political parties in spite of Washington's efforts, and created hostility with France that would lead eventually to naval conflict and near war with France during the presidency of John Adams, called the Quasi-War. Washington had a complex relationship with the Native American tribes, encompassing a range of actions from conciliation and respect to scorched earth warfare. Early in his career, he had treated the tribes with respect, announcing that, quote, "The government of the United States are determined that their administration of Indian affairs shall be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity," end quote. Washington regarded killing a native as a crime equal to killing a white man, insisted that land rights be respected, that land transfers must be negotiated, and attempted to assimilate the tribes into the U.S. system. At one point, he gave a Creek Indian chief the rank of brigadier general in the U.S. Army, along with a generous salary. Eventually, though, it fell apart. Battles between settlers and tribes in the Ohio Valley had seen a series of Indian victories, and worse, a series of atrocities by the tribal forces, including the execution of settler women and children, that outraged Washington. Washington resolved to end the conflict and sent in the army with the authority to wage a scorched earth campaign, burning Indian villages, crops, and other supplies, and driving the tribes from the Ohio Valley, eventually opening more than three-quarters of the Ohio Valley to further settlement. Washington also had a complex and evolving relationship with the institution of slavery. He was a lifelong slave owner, and during his time in office rarely if ever spoke on the subject, knowing it would divide the nation just as the nation was coming together. He seems to have provided adequate care for his slaves, feeding and clothing them relatively well, and providing medical care for sick or injured slaves. Nonetheless, while he preferred instruction to derive the desired amount of labor from his slaves, he allowed his overseers to use whips on both male and female slaves at times. He also used inducements such as cash rewards to motivate his slaves and allowed them family visitation time, as well as Sundays and religious holidays off. While he generally avoided breaking up families, he would sell rebellious or troublesome slaves, regardless of their family relationships. He spoke of wishing to be finished with slavery in 1786, calling the institution repugnant, and offering to trade slaves for land he wanted, but he refused sales that would break up families. During some years, Washington supported so many slaves either too old or too young to work that his plantation actually lost money. By 1799, when Washington wrote his will, he included instructions to free his slaves a year after his wife's death, and made provision in his will that former slaves of his would be cared for. After his death, 160 slaves were freed, and a year later, Martha Washington freed the rest. Washington's bequest cared for many of these people for the remainder of their lives until the mid-1830s. Washington's complex and evolving relationship with the institution of slavery typifies that of many of the founders, who recognized the irony in building a nation based on liberty while sanctioning and relying on the labor of enslaved human beings, and indeed owning many of those human beings themselves.